everybody. Really great to be here today and great to see so many people. As Piers just mentioned there, the talk I'm going to give today is really all around happiness. It's based on some work that we've done over in the UK with some academics, so hopefully you'll find it quite interesting. I hope you'll find it interesting just kind of following on from the other presenters today as well, talking about in particular things around loyalty, consumer decision making and customer journeys, because it all kind of ties in quite nicely really. So the title of the paper is Think Happy, which sounds a little bit frivolous, but also hopefully quite interesting to you. And it's really all around using happiness theory to close the empathy gap with consumers. And the reason I say that is because, okay, we won't use that. Okay, there we go. So today's brands are facing a new set of challenges. As it's been discussed already today, there are so many different channels available to consumers. There are so many brands available for consumers to choose. That consumers are becoming much more savvy in their purchasing choices. They're becoming much more demanding with their expectations from brands. And brands are having to work ever harder to demonstrate their relevance and their value to consumers in order for consumers to choose their products. And I'm here to argue today that as consumers are reevaluating the relationship that they have with brands, it's now time for us as an industry to reevaluate the relationship that we have with consumers. And that's because I think as an industry, we have a bit of a tendency to view consumers as data points. Actually, even just calling them consumers distances us from these creatures that we call consumers, who effectively are just humans, as are we. And as an industry, we measure very rational things like satisfaction. We think about net promoter scores. We think about future purchase intent and loyalty. Things like satisfaction, that's how businesses speak. That's not how people speak. That's not how consumers speak. So the example here from Facebook, people, when they talk about brands, they talk about loving them or hating them or liking them or having a great or a bad experience with them. They don't talk about being satisfied. The definition of to satisfy is to have just about enough of something. So if we're aiming to satisfy customers, we're not really setting the bar very high. So I think as an industry, what we need to do is we need to hold a mirror up to consumers, to think about the language that they use, to think about mirroring their behavior, their expectations, the way they talk about brands. And really, we need to empathize. I think we've forgotten that consumers are humans just like we are. It's almost like we change into something different when we go into work and start thinking about these very rational measures, particularly because as an industry, there's so much talk about the importance of emotions and understanding the decision-making context and how people are feeling. And when it comes to measurement, we default back to satisfaction. So I think that's something we need to change. So there are three things I'm going to try and convince you about today. Hopefully by the end of this, we'll have convinced you on at least a couple of these. The first thing is that happiness matters to humans. And because happiness matters to humans, it should also matter to brands. So I'm going to talk you through some academic theory around why happiness is important. The second thing I want to convince you about is that if you can make people happy at the point of usage, that's going to be really good for your brand. And again, we've done some work with academics in the UK, which I'll talk you through to kind of demonstrate that. And the third thing I want to convince you about today is that if you can make consumers experience positive emotions at the time that they're experiencing or consuming your brand, you can drive habit formation more quickly. So we'll start with the first one of those, about why happiness is important to humans. I guess for the last couple of thousand years, there have been great philosophers debating, what drives human motivation, and what are those underlying drivers of kind of what we seek as human beings, dating right back to the time in Western theory, for example, of Aristotle and Epicurus, who theorized that happiness was important and that as humans we seek to maximize our feelings of pleasure and to minimize our feelings of pain and to live a happy and tranquil life. As societies have changed, so have the theories, right through Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for example, and the latest incarnation of this has been pioneered by a guy called Martin Seligman, who you may have come across, and it's termed as positive psychology. It's colloquially known as happiness theory, and it's gaining quite a lot of traction, particularly over the last sort of 10 to 15 years or so. And there have been lots of attempts to kind of define what are the key drivers that kind of relate to happiness. And there is, again, lots of theories from Seligman's PERMA framework. The UK has its 5 actions frameworks, which tries to define that. And the UK actually have even made happiness a core national statistic. That's how important they think it is. And at Join the Dots, we've come up with our own 5 happiness drivers. It's worth saying these are primarily based on Western thinking at the moment, but we are currently in the process with our local trends consultant and cultural consultant here, working across continents to redevelop this for Asian markets, because although a lot of the theory is very similar, there are some actual slight differences, and I think we're going to be seeing some changes to the framework over the next 3 to 6 months, so we'll hopefully share that with you at some point in the future. But at the moment, the 5 drivers that we've got are karma, focus, success, relationships, and world. And these are just about people feeling that they're connected, they've got good relationships, they're connected with the world around them, they've got something to focus on. So these are the kind of underlying drivers from an academic perspective. So we did some work. We kind of bought into this idea that happiness was important, that it's something that lots of clever people and academics have been talking about for a long time. So if happiness matters to us as humans, and we live in a consumerist society, can we apply this theory to brands? And how can brands play a role in making consumers happy? So we got together with a professor from Manchester Business School in the UK, and we did some work with him where we said, can we try and see how this applies to brands? So we did a study in the UK with 500 consumers over a 4-week period. We asked them to download a mobile app, and we asked them to just go about their natural behaviour and tell us when they were buying and using products and services. And what we wanted them to do was tell us how happy they felt at the time that they were buying those products or services, and then how happy they felt when they were actually at the point of consumption or usage. We also got them to tell us how happy they felt just generally, kind of at rest, so not in relation to a brand. And we also asked them a series of other questions, such as future purchase intent, for example. And the results were actually really interesting. One thing that just before I get on to the findings, one thing that this meant was because we were using a mobile app and we wanted to capture people's experiences in the moment rather than them being post-rationalised, we had to cede some control as researchers. We had to let the participants take part, on their terms when they were experiencing the product or service, and not just when we wanted them to complete a survey. And that's really important that as researchers, maybe we need to think about being a little bit more flexible to get to those moments of truth, to really understand how people feel at that point of experience rather than post-rationalising it later on. The other thing that we did, just to see if it worked, was we asked people to upload pictures of selfies, to do selfies for us, to, again, see, is that a good measure of happiness? If we ask people to take a picture of themselves using the brand, experiencing the brand, can we infer from how happy they are through looking at the pictures and coding them into how big a smile or otherwise they had? Would that give us a more interesting measure of happiness? So that's the work that we did, and the results were actually really, really interesting. So these are genuine people from the research and some of the selfies that they took for us. You can see there's a range of different products that people were using, from things like perfume to washing powders. We didn't stipulate what sort of product it had to be, but we did want them to talk to us about a brand they'd bought before, as well as a new brand that they hadn't bought before. And we got a range, as I say, we got several hundreds of these photos to analyse, and lots of in-the-moment data over that 4-week period that we were able to work with. But what was really interesting was that we found happiness does indeed matter when it comes to consumer experience. So we found that there was a strong correlation between people who said that they were happy at the point that they were buying or experiencing the product or service and their anticipation of buying that product again. And it was stronger at the point of consumption than it was at the point of purchase. And that makes sense because you're more likely to know when you're using and experiencing a brand whether this is a good experience and therefore whether it's something that I want to repeat than you are at that point of purchase. And this applied to both new brands, so brands that people hadn't bought before. It also applied to brands that people had bought before. So happiness matters. If you can make people happy at the point that they're experiencing, consuming, or using your brand, they are more likely to say that they will buy your product again. So it's about capturing that experience in the moment and understanding whether you're making people happy. The selfies, I mentioned that we collected selfies. You can see we've got some nice examples there of selfies. Selfies don't work as a measure of happiness. There was no correlation between whether people were smiling in a photograph or not smiling in a photograph and the answers they gave in relation to future purchase intent. And there are actually a number of reasons for that, but I think the main reason is about self-curation. You can see from these pictures, these are not your typical selfie generation. We had a fairly representative sample in the UK of different age groups and demographics. These are not all millennials who are quite happy to do the poses and kind of take these selfies. And so there's kind of that aspect to it. I have no idea how many pictures these guys took before they found one that was acceptable to send us in the research. So I think that's probably why there's no correlation. I think the other thing is people generally, when they take a picture, they don't want to look miserable in a picture. They want to look happy when they're kind of taking a photograph. So for all those reasons, and probably several others as well, selfies don't work as a measure of happiness. So I'm not saying photographs don't work and getting consumers to take pictures doesn't work, but selfies don't work as a measure of happiness and how people are feeling in relation to a brand, even if you ask them to kind of do that. So that's really interesting. If we make people happy at the point that they're experiencing our brand, they're more likely to say that they'll buy it again. But I just want to move on a little bit to thinking about loyalty and kind of alluding, I guess, back to the last presentation where we talked a lot about loyalty. I would argue that a lot of what we think about as loyalty for consumers isn't loyalty at all. It's actually habit. Now, I'm not saying loyalty doesn't exist, and I know there's been some debate about what the definition of loyalty is and what that means, and I think people certainly are loyal in some situations to brands, but I think a lot of it is just out of habit. We buy things out of habit, we do things out of habit, and psychologists estimate that up to about 40% of everything we do every day is habitual. Which seems really high, but actually if you think about it, if you think about when you're going to work in the morning, you probably always go the same way to work. You probably always use the same method of transport. That's not because you have to. You could probably use several different modes of transport or several different routes to work, but you choose not to. You've got a habit of kind of doing the same thing because habits make our decision process easier. They are decisions that we've consciously made at some point in the past, but they've now become automatic responses to cues in the environment. So I know every morning, apart from today, which has disrupted my habits because I don't usually come here, but normally every morning I get off the MRT, I go and buy a coffee on the way into work. It's a habit, it's become a routine, and it's been quite interesting. I've only been here for 4 months, and I've already got lots of habits and lots of routines built up, because that's how we're designed. We're called creatures of habit as humans for a reason. Our brains are set to create habits and make decision-making easier for us. So actually, when we think about this idea of customer loyalty, sometimes we're mistaking that. It's actually around habit. So I want to talk a little bit about habit theory and how that relates to happiness as well now. When we were researching for this paper and kind of putting together our ideas around happiness, I came across the work of a professor in the States called B.J. Fogg. Now, if anybody's particularly interested in habit theory and developing new habits, whether that's personally, you want to get out to the gym more often or do a bit more exercise or whatever it is, or professionally in terms of kind of thinking about consumer habits, do look him up. B.J. Fogg, his name is, and he's got a program online that he calls Tiny Habits. And you sign up for it online. He's had tens of thousands of people go through it, and you sign up for 5 days and you commit to making some tiny habits. And I did it myself, so I can say that it works. My tiny habit, so what he says is that if you want to change behavior and you want to create a habit, you need to experience a positive emotion at the time you're doing the behavior that you want to become a habit. So he says, pick something really small to start off with and see if you can do that, and sign up for 5 days, see if it becomes an automatic behavior. So the one I picked, which was a little bit random, admittedly, I decided every time I went to the bathroom, I would do a mini sun salutation afterwards. Right, there's no reason for that. There's no particular benefit for me doing that. But I just wanted to see, does it work? I also wasn't going to do a full sun salutation in the bathroom, because that would involve getting on the floor, which would be pretty dirty. So I did this, right? There's no real benefit to me doing this, apart from theoretically, does this work? If I experience a positive emotion every time I do this, can I build a habit quite quickly? And the way that you experience a positive emotion, he says, with his tiny habit theory, is to celebrate every time you've done it. So every time I did this in the bathroom, I'd go, woo, I'm awesome. Which again is ridiculous, but it made me laugh, it made me feel positive, it gave me that positive experience, and you know what, it works. After 2.5 days, I would go to the bathroom and I would automatically do this afterwards, right, seriously. So maybe don't try that one. Other examples that might be more useful to you is if you're trying to go to the gym, you're trying to get yourself to go out for a run, and you can't be bothered to go out for a run. He says, put your trainers on. Just put your trainers on. Woo, I'm awesome. I put my trainers on, and then take them off again. And over a couple of days, it'll become an automatic behavior that, because this positive emotion is a mental shortcut to tell your brain this is something worth repeating. So over time, you can build on that habit. You put your trainers on, maybe one day you'll put your shorts on, maybe one day you'll actually get out of the house as well. And maybe it'll take you a little bit of time, but you'll get there. So if you're interested in habit theory, do have a go. Find your own, perhaps more useful tiny habit to get yourself going with that. So I did this tiny habit, so I was like, great, this positive thing works. Can we use this in relation to consumers and brands? So I had a chat with him. I called him on Skype. We had a little chat about it, and I said, can we say then, if people experience a positive emotion at the time that they're using or consuming or experiencing a brand, can that drive habit formation more quickly? And he said, absolutely, yes. And to quote him, he said, emotions create habits. So that's a really exciting idea, that if we can make people happy at the point that they're experiencing our brand, we can drive habit formation much more quickly. And if we can get rid of this idea that we're thinking about loyalty that's actually misplaced, because it's not about loyalty. Like I say, I'm not saying loyalty doesn't exist. It does in certain situations. But if we're thinking about more habitual purchases, more habitual behavior, actually what we want to drive is not loyalty at all. It's habit formation. We want to drive habit formation. So can we think about doing that? And a couple of kind of examples of this. If you think about McDonald's, if you go to McDonald's and you buy some French fries, that first French fry that you eat tastes amazing. That's the best bit of the whole meal, is that when you get that salty hit, it's firing off all the different neurons in your brain, it's making you feel great. It's telling your brain this is an experience that I want to repeat. The rest of the French fries don't taste quite as good. It's that first salty hit, it's that first beginning of the experience. If you go on a Virgin Airlines flight, you walk onto the plane, it's all red and purple, and there's music, and it's cool, and you feel a little bit like you're at a party. That's a way of experiencing this positive emotion that tells your brain, this is something I want to do again. This is something that I want to become an automatic behavior. And notice how important that very first part of the experience is as well. Brands that are doing this well have got the first part of that experience nailed, that you feel positive straight away. You experience that positive emotion. They're the ones that are going to be driving habits more quickly. So I said there were 3 things that I wanted to convince you about today. I hope I've convinced you a little bit about some of them. But the 3 things were that happiness matters to humans. And because happiness matters to humans, it should matter to brands. And the reason it should matter to brands is because if we can make people happy at the point that they're experiencing and consuming our products or services, not only is that a better indicator of whether consumers are going to buy our products again, but it's also more likely to drive habit formation more quickly. So as researchers and as marketers, I think there are a couple of key things that we should take away from this to kind of think about happiness. The first thing that I think we need to consider is that actually we need to get close to the moment that consumers are experiencing our brands. We need to probably cede a bit of control, be a little bit more flexible with the research methodologies that we employ to really get close to that moment of truth when our brands are being experienced and really understand how are people feeling at that point. How is that going to impact on habitual behavior, on whether they buy our brand again? And as I say, that's going to require us being a bit more flexible in the research methods we use. I think the second thing is we need to think more about the context that people operate in. So we need to understand that people's behavior is driven by habits, we need to understand that it's driven by emotions, and we need to take that into account when we're designing and analysing our research. And the final thing, and this is a little bit of a plea to kind of make a bit of a change within the industry, is to kind of ditch those rational measures of things like satisfaction. We should be measuring happiness. We should be understanding people's emotions. We do it, you know, a lot of people do it really well in qualitative research, but as soon as it comes to any sort of measurement, we default back to thinking about very traditional and rational measures of satisfaction. So we should be measuring happiness, because happiness is what matters to humans, so it should matter to us as researchers as well. Thank you.